Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bobby Marlab and I am the co-founder of Mentor Walks. It is our enormous pleasure in this very important NAIDOC week to bring you this iconic conversation series on women leading for change. I'm very quickly going to hand over to the wonderful Shirley Chowdhary, who's one of Mentor Walks Advisory Council members, but also a former lawyer, time and investment banker. She, very importantly, was the CEO of the Go Foundation, which leads in Indigenous education, and is currently chair of Women for Election Australia and many other things. And we are very indebted to Shirley for leading this important conversation today. Over to you, Shirley.
Thank you, Bobby. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'd like to start on behalf of everybody to acknowledge that wherever you are dialing in from today, you are dialing in from land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and we acknowledge that today. So welcome to everybody. I'm coming to you from Camaragal land, in the lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present and thank them for their ongoing custodianship and love of this land. For those of you who aren't familiar with acknowledgements to country, we give them at the beginning of a function or an event, and traditionally they were given by Aboriginal elders as First Nations people moved between different countries on this land as a way of welcome and safe passage through that country. I'm very pleased today to have an exceptional panel with me. Topaz McAuliffe, Shelley Cable and Lisa Davies. Welcome to all of you. Sorry, the screen's rearranging as I'm saying these things. So I think there's one more person I can't see on my screen, Mentor Walks, and that's Lisa Davies. If we can change the screen. Thank you, that's perfect. Hello, ladies. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves first, and then we'll launch straight in. Can I start with you, Shelley?
Thanks so much, Shelley. Kaya, everyone. Nyang Kwel Shelley, Nyang Buja woman. I'm Shelley Cable. I'm a Wilman Noongar woman, and I'd like to acknowledge the lands that I'm dialing in from today. I'm dialing in from Boorloo or Perth, which is on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects also to their elders and my elders, past and present. I'm the director of Generation One, which is an initiative of Minderoo Foundation seeking to close the Indigenous employment gap or create employment parity, as we prefer to talk about it. So I look very much forward to our conversation here today with you, Shelley, and my fellow panelists. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Shelley. Over to you, Topaz.
Hi, thanks everyone. Topaz McAuliffe, CEO of an Indigenous owned consultancy called 15 Times Better. And we really specialise in scalable impact and every activity that you do linked to line of sight to an opportunity for an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. I'm dialing in from beautiful Cairns. I think most people were dialing in from places a bit cooler than that, up here on Gimoy country as well. And would like to pay my respects obviously to the all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well on the call today, and the countries in which I'm on.
Thank you, Topaz. And we're all jealous. I'm sitting here with my Nana blanket around my lap. So, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Davies. I am the Chief Executive of AAP, Australian Associated Press, which is the national newswire of Australia. Previously to that, I was the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald for nearly 5 years and was the editor who reinstituted Indigenous affairs reporting at that masthead and across the age as well. So it's long been a passion of mine. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am, which is Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lisa. There's a few, so before, while everyone was registering, people sent their questions in, and there are a few comments sent in, and I'd just like to address those at the outset before we jump into questions with the panel. The first question that was sent in is, why isn't the panel all Indigenous, given that it is NAIDOC week? I want to say up front, this is, whilst NAIDOC week and Reconciliation week are really important weeks for First Nations people, the demand on them is immense. And I, for one, believe very strongly that that cultural load shouldn't just be put on First Nations people, that we should all share that load. And I'm sure that will come up as we talk about it today. Secondly, I'm sure that in questions, people will have questions about the referendum. In many ways, this NAIDOC week is probably the most significant NAIDOC week in our history. And sadly, I heard today from some First Nations friends that the questioning and the abuse that they are suffering on panels this week has been the worst that they have ever suffered in terms of questions and judgments being made. We're not going to do that today. So if you have questions on the referendum, I would ask you to moderate those questions. We won't answer all the questions on the referendum, and I don't expect anybody on the panel to have to share their views on which way they will or won't vote. Our aim with any questions on the referendum today is to make sure that we're doing our part in helping you get active in the conversation. And it's incumbent on all of us as voting members of this country, voting citizens, to make sure that when we vote in the referendum, we're making an educated vote. So I'd ask you to keep that in mind today. The theme of NAIDOC Week this year is For Our Elders. And I want to read something to you from the NAIDOC website. The committee of NAIDOC says this. They say, the struggles of our elders help to move us forward today. The equality we continue to fight for is found in their fight. Their tenacity and strength has carried the survival of our people. It is their influence and through their learnings that we must ensure that when it comes to future decision-making for our people, there is nothing about us without us. And that's where I want to pick up the discussion today. There's two themes we want to explore today. The first is the narratives about our First Nations people in the media, in our corporations, in our homes, in our conversations, and how that affects what we think and what we do and the action that we take. And then the second, that will lead us straight into the discussion about employment. Employment opportunities for our First Nations people and employment parity, and what that will ask actually one of our speakers to explain what that means a little bit later on. But these are really important discussions to have as we move towards hopefully what is one day a reconciled country, where we reconcile our history and our past with our future. And so they're the themes we're going to discuss today, very closely linked to For Our Elders, but perhaps in a different way than what you might have imagined when you jumped on this call. Lisa, I'd like to start with you and picking up on the theme of the narratives that we tell ourselves about our First Nations people. You're in the media, and in many ways, people might blame the media for some of the narratives that we hear. The narratives feed into government policy, like close the gap policies, which for those people who aren't familiar, we talk about a deficit narrative, where we talk about fixing First Nations people, closing a gap, lesser than, better than, and there's a real need to move away from that kind of narrative to one of empowerment and self-determination. Lisa, can you talk about, during your time in the media, how that's changed or what you've observed?
Absolutely. And I think it is something that is, I should just say from the outset, undergoing a lot of change even as we speak. And I think mostly in positive ways. But just speaking from my own experience, when I was first in journalism, there wasn't a lot of Indigenous affairs reporting as a bespoke area, and I think from my recollections, it went particularly downhill around the time of the digital explosion, when major news organisations went online and could see very clearly what stories people were reading. And many organisations, and I've worked for all the major print media organisations in this country, I think it's fair to say once people could actually see the data and see what people were clicking on, there was a real appetite across many news organisations to really focus on stories that people were reading in large volume. So unfortunately, those stories were not stories as they related to Indigenous people. And so as a result, resourcing was not put in those areas. Wherever stories were written, they were usually, and to your point, Shirley, around narratives and deficit language and stuff, it was always bad stories. Like, they've always been very negative and focused on very the statistics that we all know far too well. So there wasn't a lot of focus on this in terms of newsroom resourcing. It really became very a real side issue. And I know that a number of reporters who had been designated in that, and certainly I should say, I don't know a single, I'm trying to wrap my brain quickly, but I don't know, in that time, I don't remember anyone being a First Nations reporter telling their own stories. And I stand corrected on that. I don't know all the media outlets. And of course, there is a lot of First Nations media, which they've done wonderful work. But I'm just speaking more broadly about mainstream media. I think what's happened over the recent few years, so when I was at the Sydney Morning Herald, we really identified that there was a major gap in our reporting as an organisation. It was in probably the 12 months after the Uluru Statement was declared. I think as the editor of the Herald at the time in 2017, I put my hand up and say we probably didn't pay that the attention it deserved at the time. There was a lot happening. I was also in the middle of I was only 6 months into my editorship, not even 4 months, and was in the middle of a major redundancy program and having to cut. So my attention probably was not on the news cycle that particular week, and it happened quite late on one Friday evening. There were lots of excuses which aren't good enough, but in the 12 months that followed, I really became very personally engaged with the issue, and it was around that time that I looked to re-employ or to employ a First Nations journalist as the Herald's Indigenous Affairs correspondent and commit the Sydney Morning Herald at the time to the Uluru Statement. From that point, the conversations I started to have really started to change. Working with a young reporter who had since gone on to 7:30. She was our Indigenous Affairs correspondent. She gave me a lot of advice, and we talked a lot about the importance of telling stories from a First Nations perspective, talking about the positive stories that don't get out there. And it was a huge part of what her role was. It's like, let's not just always, focus on the terrible statistics. And for example, rather than just report the closing the gap statistics out of Canberra, very boring and rote, and let's just read the report. We sent her to the Cape. She went up to did a whole trip up there around that time and actually was in community and talking to people. And these are the statistics you are talking about. This is the impact. So to really try and tell stories with real examples and real people and tell them from those perspectives, not just raw data, to give it meaning. Yep. So I think over time, sorry, I'm talking a lot. And I think over time, those kinds of issues have played out in lots of, the Australian actually for many people would view them as having a lot of faults. I've done wonderful Indigenous Affairs reporting over the years in some cases and others not. And I think everyone has their high and low points, but there is a lot more focus now, I think, on really bringing First Nations journalists to the fore in telling those stories.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think that's a really important message, that the media in many ways has led that negative narrative, but it is trying to change. And we'll come back to you at the end of this, because I know, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Australian Associated Press, so I know closely what they're doing. But I'd love you to talk about the work you're doing in that space now. Shelley, as a young woman growing up in Perth, how have you reacted to that narrative that comes out of the media? And what does it mean for a young First Nations person to hear those narratives? And have you noticed a change? And for a young girl or boy today, listening to those stories and hearing those stories from the hands and the mouths of First Nations reporters in particular, How important is that? I used to work with a young Indigenous woman. She's a reporter now. And she said that when she was growing up and she heard Brooke Boney on Triple J start her morning with Yama, she said it filled her with such immense pride that language that she could relate to was on the radio. Can you tell us a little bit about that from your perspective?
Oh, I will jump on board the Brooke Bodie train any day. She's been just incredible
Fabulous.
and such an inspiration. I think for me, I'm the kind of person who doesn't follow the news a great deal, if I'm completely honest, and I think it makes me a happier person, because it means that the kind of information that I'm feeding myself comes from people who I follow on social media or on Facebook, people that I'm friends with, and I'm friends with a lot of incredible First Nations people. Like that, there are so many of them out there who just don't get their voices heard through mainstream media. For me, I know we'll get to the referendum a little bit later, but to see so many incredible First Nations leaders who I look up to with such respect, just lead some incredible work for this country over many, many, many years. That's the kind of stories that I want to be following. They're the kinds of people I want to be following. And for me, I think growing up, I think unless you get a counter narrative, we all fall victim to thinking about First Nations people as dual bludgers, as unemployed, as less intelligent than other people. Even in school, you'd listen and you'd understand about what opportunities are there for support for First Nations students, and it's always about extra tuition and extra support, because it kind of and that implies that we need more help. We're not as smart as other people. So unless you've got a counter narrative, which thankfully I do in my family, you can fall victim to thinking that's just the way that it is. So for me, to follow and to be connected with such incredible First Nations people across this country, there's no shortage. And when you talk about people like Brooke Boney or Dan Berkshire or Nerelda Jacobs, you can name so many of them. To see them on mainstream TV and media is one of the most inspiring things, honestly. And for me, the most inspiring part is, I remember very clearly when Brooke Boney went on when she was on Sunrise, and it was a whole big deal for her to be on mainstream breakfast TV. That was a big deal in itself. Yeah. And then you might remember
it was the rival one. Woman. It was the Today Show.
It was the Today Show, but first Indigenous woman on breakfast TV. I remember she rang me when she got that contract, and she rang me and she was literally screaming down the phone, saying, oh my God, I'm going to be the first woman on breakfast TV.
That's right. And it's not just a job for these people. The significance of it is not lost on us. And I remember so clearly when it was January 26th and she had a chance to express her views. I think Nerelda Jacobs did another one relatively recently. And just having someone put a different side of the story forward as respectfully as she did was one of the most inspiring moments, to see someone who's in an environment where they are the only First Nations person to still hold and speak their truth in a respectful way that I really hope people took in the right way. Those kinds of things, you remember for years, because they're just so significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also really important to acknowledge, we talked about cultural load at the beginning of this panel. It's really important to acknowledge the incredible responsibility that people like Brooke and other women and men who are the first in those roles feel when they are in those roles, but also how remarkable it is when somebody hasn't had the counter narratives that you described, Shelley, in their immediate sphere, when they haven't had those counter narratives and they are the first in family to graduate from university or the first in family to graduate from school. We might all take that for granted for our children, but these are actually really incredible milestones. And so when you see somebody on LinkedIn, a young Indigenous man or woman, celebrating these things, understand the barriers that they've had to walk through or push down to get there. That journey has not been the same as your journey. Topaz, you've done such great work with Coles in particular and Wesfarmers. Can you tell us a little bit about how those narratives that we've just described fed into the view of one of Australia's largest corporations when you arrived there in terms of their employment of First Nations people?
Yes, I'll be happy to.
And also, if there's anything else you want to jump in on, feel free. I want this to be a conversation, so don't feel like you all have to wait your turn.
Yeah, I think for me, it's sort of been 13 or 14 years now specialising in what is sort of now called the Indigenous affairs sector. And back when I started at Coles, I'd actually spent a year before that working with an organisation to understand why Indigenous unemployment was so bad in regional locations. And that 12 months helped me understand that all of the myths and the misconceptions were that it was the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander job seekers that were the issue, when in fact it was actually the system that was broken. And so by understanding that and then getting to work at a large corporate, which at the point in time was hiring 30,000 people a year, I think Wesfarmers itself was more than that, in a group of 220,000, and not having anything positive in the media, because it was at that deficit narrative, as Lisa spoke to. There was nothing to look to read that was positive. And so anyone who had that one bad experience, that's actually just was what was burnt into their brain when you talk to them about, hey, we're going to start doing First Nations employment. What changed it, though, was going really strategic around, and this, there's challenges around this at the time. And when you talk to some people, they may not agree with it being the right approach. But in the very first instances of doing, entry-level employment, it was actually finding the most exceptional people to do those jobs, so that the first experience that someone was having, either for the first time or the second time attempting Indigenous employment, their response is, oh my God, this person's actually better than half the staff that are working here.
Sorry, Toby, that's a really, really important point. Last year, I interviewed somebody in the US, and she was a Nigerian Australian, and she runs a cosmetic company, Sharon Shuja. And she said the day when she was talking about anyone of colour, but it applies to First Nations people, the day when they can be as average as a non-First Nations person and get the same job will be a day that we've hit parity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I even think back to, and this individual is now one of, my closest kind of relationships. But I remember being introduced to a group of executives and being referred to that, look how well she speaks and look how amazing she's dressed, in a professional role. But I and this is, you talk about cultural load. Not everybody can be in a situation and take that information and be okay. But I think in my mind, where I was at was I actually knew where all of the pieces were broken. I understood the solution. So if I was able to connect those two things together, and if it was at a company like Coles, all of a sudden you have 120,000 people who've got a positive experience. Mm-hmm. And so the bit around the storytelling, that I think where the power was, and probably something we didn't focus on well enough, because it was just about making sure that we got everything done in a way that we weren't going to get ridiculed, because it's always a risk in this space as well. We actually forgot to tell the good stories. So it wasn't until the evolution and, the changing of leadership with Christy Lee, who's at the helm at Coles now, where she was like, I didn't know that all of this was going on, and spent the next couple of years actually celebrating those stories. So the power in that positive narrative, but also then that lived experience and interaction, that's when I think kind of scalable employment will happen. And I believe it'll happen in my lifetime based on all the positive stuff we're experiencing and seeing today.
Wouldn't that be amazing? We'll come back to employment in a moment. Lisa, I'm keen for you to share with everybody, Australian Associated Press has done some really remarkable things in helping to shift that narrative. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So AAP is effectively a wholesaler of news. So we have more than 450 different organisations who take our content around the country. That's from very, largely in rural and regional Australia. So newspapers, radio stations, also to the major metros, all the old Fairfax papers, the Guardian, all clients of ours, West Australian newspapers. So we have a huge reach. And one of the things that we created last year was an Indigenous affairs desk. So that is two reporters who are entirely focused on Indigenous affairs reporting, and the senior journalist is not First Nations, but she was the editor of the Courier Mail for 10 years, and she's very experienced. And we have a fabulous young reporter who's actually still finishing her degree, but she, a young First Nations woman who is also writing for us on that desk. And it's incredible that I just was actually looking through the volume of stories that they're producing. I mean, we aim to basically over the 12 months, they kicked off early February, produce in excess of 500 stories, which goes directly to all these publications that I've just referred to, and also shared with our international partners where appropriate, so our international newswire partners. And the other thing that we're doing, and this particularly relates to the referendum, of course, is fact checking. So AAP has a fact check arm, called AAP Fact Check, and we have received some additional funding for the work that we do from a couple of the major tech platforms to use First Nations voices in our fact checking. So asking them about so we're not just, the people we have involved are not just, making their own assessments and talking to academics and the like. We're actually consulting First Nations voices for that too. So all that content is free, and I can pop the link to, it is published freely. Everyone can view it on our website as part of our international accreditation, but it's something that's really important to us. We are fact-based, we do no opinion, and it is all about making sure people have the right information for the referendum.
Thanks, Lisa. And as we approach already the fact check work, you can see it on Instagram, you see it on TikTok. They're dispelling some of the misinformation out there, which is really...
And it is increasing exponentially.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I want to encourage everybody in the audience to please put questions in the chat. We're going to go to Q&A in a little while, and we'd love to have a bank of questions that we can start selecting from. So if you've got questions for any of the panelists or comments you'd like to share, please use the chat. I also want to just, before we leave the negative narrative, I just want to raise something for everybody's attention. Lisa put a link to an article in The Guardian in the chat. It's the first thing in today's chat. Today, one of the mainstream newspapers posted an advert for the No campaign, which is based around the worst racist tropes that we have all seen and can imagine. And I would encourage you, as somebody who sits on the board of a media organisation, that if you don't like it, complain. It's the only way we get those things changed. I find it offensive. I'm sure lots of others find it offensive, and we shouldn't have such negative material in our mainstream papers. On that note, I'd like to move now to employment and really give some of the audience members practical tips on how we can shift employment parity. Shelley, can I come to you just to explain to us what employment parity is? And then Topaz, I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that work you did at Coles and what are some of the practical things that people can take away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shelley. That's great conversation. I've already learned so much, and I'm on the panel, so I hope our listeners are enjoying as well. On employment parity, I just want to acknowledge upfront that I'm speaking in the presence of one of the best legends in Indigenous employment, Topaz. So please jump in and correct me or add anything that I miss. But employment parity is a term around that means that we should see proportional representation of First Nations people in a workforce, proportional to the representation that we make up in the broader Australian population. So, for example, we're approximately 3.2% of the Australian population. Therefore, parity suggests that we should also reflect roughly 3.2% of Australian workplaces across the country. Some of you might pick up some flaws in that argument pretty quickly, and I'm really pleased to see that the conversation around parity is getting a bit more nuanced. It's not as simple as getting people into jobs for numbers' sake, but actually that the conversation is shifting towards more qualitative measures around what success looks like, not just parity in terms of First Nations employment. So looking at not just are they 3% of the workforce, because if if that metric is achieved, but everyone's in entry-level jobs, that's not really the game that we're going for here. We want to see diversity in seniority, in types of roles, in locations, in retention, all kinds of things. So I hope that parity these days means a little bit more better rounded definition of success than just a 3.2% percentage figure. In terms of how employment parity is going in this country, I just sort of, if I can, Shirley, I really wanted to pick up on a point that Lisa made earlier around the deficit narrative. And I even noticed it in myself when I introduced myself this evening. When I introduced what Generation 1 did, I said we're trying to close the employment gap, and then explained it as employment parity. And I do that because it's easier for people to grasp. It's a concept that people understand and can connect with much quicker. Closing the gap, we all know what that is, whereas employment parity takes a while to explain. So I was just reflecting on even how I introduce myself. Sometimes we feed off that ourselves in order to communicate our points. But essentially, the employment parity and the employment gap, as it's measured by the government, is not going super well, if I'm honest. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. According to our modelling at Generation 1, we need approximately another 300,000 First Nations people in work by 2040 if we want that gap to be closed, meaning that if you're a First Nations person of working age, you have an equal shot of being in employment as other Australians. That's a lot of people, especially when you consider that there's approximately 1 million First Nations people in this country. For the first time ever this year in Closing the Gap reporting, there has been some positive news, which I'm really excited about, and that's where I prefer to focus the conversation. In the space of 5 years, between the census 2016 and 2021, the number of First Nations people employed increased more than 40%. In 5 years. For context, the First Nations population in this country grew 25% over those 5 years, which is also huge. But to know that there's almost 260,000 people in work is a huge achievement, and that number has just grown so much in 5 years. It's really interesting too to look at the different cohorts that make up those kinds of statistics. If you look at First Nations people over the age of 25, the employment gap is actually on track to be met, which is the first time in history. So I'm really happy about that. I'd obviously like it to happen sooner, but we'll take it. But if you look at First Nations youth employment, so those who are aged 15 to 24, the gap is huge. It's getting it is certainly not on track. It's closing like by the smallest amount, but it is still, more than 50 years away of that gap being closed. And given that First Nations people are predominantly young, more than half of our population is under the age of 24, there's a huge amount of work to be done to support our young people into employment. I'll leave my little lecture on employment parity there.
That's perfect for people who don't know what that is. That was a really great intro. Thanks, Shelley. Topaz, how does this play out in our organisations, and what can we do to move the dial? The biggest argument that I always hear when, not in my organisations because they're a little bit more enlightened, but I hear from people all the time, we can't find First Nations people for those roles. They don't exist, or the ones that do exist are in such high demand that you have to pay too much. I can't afford it. Like, these are arguments that get circulated all the time. They get circulated about all sorts of minorities. We get them about women, we get them about First Nations people. What's the answer?
So a lot of organisations start on this journey because they have signed up for a RAP is generally the most common reason. And so when you ask people at an organisation why you're doing this, it's because they've got commitments in their RAP. And I think what we've learned, so after leaving Coles 2.5 years ago, we've now worked with 28 different companies across sort of 40 different types of projects. And so we've actually been able to refine A, what was the problem, and B, the solution. And the solution's actually that everybody looks outward facing first. They do that first when they should actually be looking internally around their own systems and processes in that are creating these barriers. But the other element to that is when a lot of people are signing up for these commitments and your driver becomes a target, which is generally like a target that is not an evidence-based, statistically analysed number that's achievable. It's because they've been sort of thought, well, 3%'s in there. You end up with a bunch of people who actually don't look at this type of work as something they need to invest in commercially. And therefore you get a lot of well-intended people out there trying to do what they think they should be doing. And then nobody ends up increasing their First Nations employment. It's also really costly. So to do this properly and to set it up, it does actually cost a lot of money, as you would any type of, if you're targeting recruitment in any particular way. I think a lot of companies, once they understand that, they then get a better sense of actually, is parity or the numbers that we're looking at enough for us to invest, you know, a significant $500,000 potentially setting up a program. So it's actually getting to a basis of going, instead of looking outward facing, stop and take a look internally and do some analysis to understand what is reasonable for us as an organisation to offer based on your footprint, the types of roles that you have. Everybody jumps to scholarships in university. There's so many people in that space. I think what we help organisations do is understand what you should be doing, why, and then getting to a number that is comfortable for you, but also then sometimes helping you realise maybe you're doing better than you thought you were based on what's out there. I think one of the pieces of work that we did, because we're constantly looking at the numbers, and again, as Shelley mentioned, there's so many different interpretations, is that if every organisation that had a RAP employed 16 people, the gap would be shut. So the number, if you're looking at it just from that point, it's very achievable. I think the problem is a lot of people just don't know how to do it. There's a lot of really well-intentioned people, but they don't know the how, and the how's the missing bit. So because you've signed up to a RAP or another type of commitment, it's actually the strategy that underpins that is where your success is. And that's what we're finding is consistently the challenge is most people have got these great commitments out there. They've got fantastic leaders who are invested in it, but then it gets handed off to the practitioners below, and often the allocation of the target is given to the wrong people. So the focus is left with hiring, well, P&C, you've got to manage all that. But in actual fact, it's your hiring managers that have all the control over whether someone gets a job, but then also the people that they're working with are a big part of the retention issue. So a lot of the effort is put at the wrong area of the business. And I think that's one of the things that once people start to understand those things, it becomes a lot clearer. And some can actually make the tweaks a bit quicker and easier, but others are actually, this is, you know, it's going to take us 5 or 10 years to do this based on the, you know, our centralized or decentralized recruitment systems, the systems that we actually use, the, you know, or a lot of, which is this, you know, obviously everyone would probably have some experience with this, is we've got to restructure and make people redundant now. So we've actually got too many people. We don't have any jobs. So it's actually about making measured assessments and looking at it through a strategic lens and any other commercial project that you would, and interpreting the data to provide the outcomes. And it doesn't sound very sexy, but if you can get that right, that's when you scale. So going from hiring 50 people a year to consistently hiring 1,800 people a year is what that process then helped us do at Coles. And that's sort of what we're seeing other companies do now. And when you put the effort in and you invest in it, it is the evidence is there that it works. So it does work. So when people say it doesn't, we've got enough evidence to sort of dispute that now. But I do think there's an element of, there's a lot of companies who want to do it, but if you've got commercial imperatives and you're being asked to invest, you know, $750,000 into something, that's where it actually becomes really difficult for companies to justify on that. But that's where we talk about, well, actually, what could your greatest impact be? Is it a job at this point in time for this person, or could you work with 50 Indigenous businesses and potentially provide 1,000 jobs? So I think it's just about companies having permission to stop, take a breath and look internally to see where they're at.
It sounds like, because I'm sure there's lots of people in the audience who don't come from the massive organizations that have 100,000 employees. You know, these participants might have 50 employees or 100 employees or smaller organizations. It sounds like the first lesson you're suggesting is get the data. Look internally, look at your hiring practices, but it's not just hiring practices. We all have a responsibility to think about First Nations engagement. Michael McDaniels, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous at UTS, said to me once, he said, success will be when Indigenous engagement is not a bolt-on team whose full-time job it is to think about how we get First Nations people through the door. It will be successful when everybody has it as a KPI. How can we engage with that space better? So if you're in community, how can you engage better? If you're in finance, well, what are you doing to make sure that there is pay parity? If you're in HR, what are the barriers in your hiring practices, and what empowerment are you giving to your individual divisional managers to make decisions and bring people on? Shelley, do you have any examples of where smaller companies have done that really well? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
No, so happy to talk about it, and just want to absolutely ditto everything that Topaz has said. What I would recommend, if I can do a quick plug, around like the data piece is absolutely critical. I wanted to call out that, like just to reiterate that, often it's actually employers who need to do a lot more work, not First Nations people. And that's been
fix First Nations people. We have to fix our systems and our barriers in our organisations.
Yeah, and as Topaz said, like looking internally, making sure that your workplace is somewhere that First Nations people want to come and work and then want to stay. Like there are often questions that employers don't ask themselves, like why would a First Nations person want to come and work for you? Knowing that, you know, Western educated First Nations people are in very high demand, employers need to start doing a better job of attracting our people, I think is where we're getting. I was just going to mention some research that we've done as Generation One in partnership with Murrowan and Bank West Curtin Economic Centre. It's called the Indigenous Employment Index. And we looked at around about 40 organisations across the country to try and build that evidence base that Topaz is talking about, around what practices and policies do they have in place, what is their culture like internally, and then what do their results look like in terms of First Nations employment. We translated that research into what we're calling the employer roadmap to First Nations employment. I can drop the link in the chat. I'll just do it. I'll quickly grab that link for you. But it's applicable to any employer. It shows you the different areas of First Nations employment to look at. It's not just recruitment. That's where a lot of employers go wrong. I'm sure Topaz has seen that. It's not just about recruitment, it's about retention, which is critical. It's around culture, which is absolutely critical and the hardest stuff to change. So on that roadmap, you'll see a few different areas that you can focus, and it shows what the research has told us. If employers do these certain things, depending on whether they're at the beginning of their journey or if they're much further advanced, here are the kinds of things the research tells us will actually help towards employment parity. So I'll find that link in a second and drop it in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. I think
Shirley, do you mind, in the interest of following your advice of jumping in, just from my experience as an employer, one of the things that we are doing at the moment, and it's experience that I learned previously, is around that culture piece. And I think the feedback I had at the Sydney Morning Herald, when Ella moved after her first 12 months, moved on to her next job, we had a big debrief about what it had been like for her as a First Nations journalist working in a very big major newsroom. She'd come from NITV, and you know, her main piece of feedback was, like, she was fine because she was experienced enough, but she said that it is quite challenging to be the only First Nations person in an office, because everyone will just walk, oh, you know, she's not speaking on behalf of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the country. She isn't, you know, she's not capable or interested in being a spokesperson for every small question that another reporter might have around an issue or a subject area. And it was something that I've really taken on board, and in fact also just being able to build in those sort of support mentorships and ability, particularly outside of an organization as well. And one thing we're doing at the moment is partnering with, and again this sort of goes to how there's so much change happening in this space. There's an organization called Media Diversity Australia, who recently came and did a bunch of diversity and inclusion training at AAP, and in particular has a number of ambassadors or mentors who can work with newsrooms and connect people and really try and build those support networks, so that, you know, Ella's experience isn't replicated or ever again, really, because it would just be extremely challenging and something that we just hadn't sort of picked up on.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.
Just one quick point to add to that as well. Just a practical thing that you can do regardless of how big or small your organisation is actually understand the data, as in, are you allowing people to identify at application stage? And if they are they progressing to interview? And if they're not, that's your first checkpoint. And if they are progressing to interview but not converting to a hire, that's your checkpoint. And so that's just a really simple, but not many people actually track the data in the first place. And so if you're not getting anyone apply and tick that box, it's pretty standard now. Most people just expect to respond to it. Then you've got an attraction issue. So there's some basic things that don't cost a lot of time or effort just to maybe understand where you're at.
Yeah, really important. And I think you mentioned the Reconciliation Action Plan earlier, Topaz. If you're an organisation or in an organisation that celebrates your Reconciliation Action Plan during Reconciliation Week and NAIDOC Week, and the rest of the year it sits in the bottom drawer and nobody really pays it much heed, except that one time a year when you pull it out to make sure you're hitting targets, that's not an authentic response to a Reconciliation Action Plan. You know, I think it goes to what Shelley said. If you've got no Indigenous employees, if your Reconciliation Action Plan sits in the bottom drawer for most of the year, if your First Nations applicants aren't proceeding through the process, there are issues, and identifying those issues are really, really important. I'd like to go to some of the comments and the questions in the chat. Somebody, and I'm not going to read names because everybody's got different names attached to their profiles in Zoom. Somebody says, I come from a health research background. Is there any advice on how to overcome some of the challenges associated with trying to find support for First Nations projects? How do we, maybe Lisa, you established the Indigenous desk. And I know there was lots of kind of support for that, but how did you go about finding funders for that? Because it is a philanthropically funded desk.
Yeah, it is. And we went through a number of channels, and I had some conversations that went very far and then faltered at the last hurdle for various reasons. I think in the end, it came about by just identifying organisations that share your vision and passion for the project. I was very lucky it's the Snow Foundation that was the first supporter of our Indigenous Affairs desk, and they are very passionate in this space and do a lot of. They're not an enormous foundation, but they are significant in size, and they do a lot of work. And just you know, from their perspective, obviously they're very passionate in support of the Yes campaign and wanting to see the referendum's success. So I had someone at the sort of exec management level, as well as someone on the board that I knew as well, who could help push it through. And we just were able to align on that score. And once we had them, we were able to get another one that's an anonymous donor, but very similar in their perspectives and priorities.
Thank you. I want to go to some resources in a sec, but Kerry's asked, much of what you've shared, e.g. understanding stats, reviewing hiring processes, applies across all underrepresented and disadvantaged groups, people with a disability, LGBTIQ+, women. How do organisations prioritise which people and groups to focus on? I'm going to jump in and answer this one, but happy for any of the panel to jump in. This is not a hierarchy. We don't go women, First Nations, disability, LGBTIQ. The population that you are targeting in your products and in your services is a population made up of all sorts of people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different nationalities, disabilities, sexual orientations. And it is up to all of us to make sure that our products and our services are targeting all of those people. And that means that the decisions being made in your organisations have to be made by a diverse range of people who understand what it's like to buy and sell to your diverse population. And so I don't think this is a hierarchy. I think it's actually looking across your hiring practices, not just in HR, but as Topaz said, in all your teams and divisions, and working out how you can do all of those better, because the same practices that apply to one will apply across the board. I don't know, ladies, would you like to add anything? Topaz, you look like you're about to jump in.
I'll just quickly say, so that's actually a very common question that happens all the time, but an effective, what I would say, strategy actually encompasses all your pillars. So a lot of organisations don't have a centralised roadmap. So whatever your most dominant, a project is, if your company's big on ESG, if it is First Nations, if it's big on D&I or women in leadership, and whatever has been effective, it's actually, everything needs to feed into that framework. And so anything you do should be adding value to that. And so a lot of the times we actually plug in First Nations into, if it's ESG, if it's into the other pillars of the organisation. And what comes out of that as well is a review, you know, of your customers, your clientele, like where should you be focusing? Because in reality, it's a shared benefit. So if you put the effort in, you'll get the shared benefit back. But in some instances, it makes more sense for some companies to absolutely put their First Nations on steroids, their engagement. And for others, it might be that it is your clientele. So it's not a one size fits all. And I think that's probably back to that piece around doing the review properly to understand what should you focus on. Because the reality is that it's got to supersede anyone who's running the company, any new managers that come in. So it's got to make sense to your organisation, regardless of what else is going on. And that's what I think is the greatest opportunity, because most organisations we've worked with hadn't synced all that properly together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I jump in there as well, Shirley? I
Please.
think that's such a good question to be asking. I was going to make a couple of quick points. One is that once you start listing out all these different types of diverse groups, then you also get down to the levels of intersectionality, the fact that you can be a woman and also First Nations person, and also LGBTQ. So it gets more complicated the more that you try and break these things up. What I've observed is that employers who focus on First Nations, and obviously it's 3% of the population, so it's not a huge percentage, but employers who invest in First Nations employment or reconciliation more broadly in terms of changing their workplace culture, becoming more inclusive and diverse, it actually has flow-on impacts for the other diverse groups as well. Like if you're making your workplace more inclusive, chances are it'll be a better place to work for everybody, not just the First Nations people. And we've seen quite a number of examples of that as well, is just exactly that. Focus on, I describe it as focusing on an extreme user case, or like the most extreme or most disadvantaged, if you want to call it that, because the more effort that you put in, the more things that you actually change in your organisation to accommodate our people, actually, it honestly makes the whole workplace better for all employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And the research is unequivocal that a more diverse workplace that is representative of the people you are selling and targeting and servicing in your organization means you have better financial return as well. Like there's no question about that. And so that to me seems like a no-brainer. Like that if you argue with everything else, you can't argue with that.
Yeah, that's right. And Shirley, I've heard you use a great example on previous events around as employers are beginning to understand that January 26 may not be a day of celebration for First Nations people. It's kind of opened up other examples of, for example, Christmas. Like if you're not Christian living in this country, is that the right holiday to be celebrating? And so it just is kind of the thin end of the wedge to help other people understand that not all of us see the same days the same way or see your workplaces the same way.
That's absolutely right. And our companies have to celebrate. At Women for Election, we talk about the richness of our diversity. We have to celebrate that richness because there are such good things that come out of that. I'd just like to share with everyone some resources. These are just off my bookshelf behind me. But because it's NAIDOC week, it's important that we all share these. So the first one is Dark Emu. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a story about our history. We celebrate here in this country the oldest living, surviving culture in the world. We have the first bakers, the first of so many different things. Bruce Pascoe is an Indigenous elder. He's also written a version for young kids, so that's a great one. The Sydney Wars talks about the truth of our history in Sydney. This one, The Original Australians, talks about the truth of our history across the country, not just in Australia, with a big focus on Tasmania. And this one I want to highlight for everybody, The Voice to Parliament. It's by Tom Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, Kerry's X730 report. It is such an easy read. It's very thin. I read it in the time it takes to watch a movie. So if you are voting this year, I would ask you to invest those 2 hours. My husband said it took him 3 hours, so maybe it's 3 hours. Invest that time to read this. Tom Mayo gives the Indigenous perspective, and Kerry gives the historical perspective and the kind of governance perspective. It is outstanding reading. It's $16.99 and available everywhere. So I'd just like to invite the panel. Last words, it's NAIDOC week. Last words before we leave. Topaz.
Yeah, I think positive narrative. What we're seeing is that things are definitely shifting and changing. So I'm really excited about the next decade.
Thank you. Shelley?
I'll change tack really, really quickly about the referendum, given you've just shared that book there, Shirley. For the non-First Nations people on this call, please take the referendum super seriously. I've mentioned before that we are, as First Nations people, only 3% of the population in this country, and we are asking all Australians to vote on a First Nations issue. So even though it doesn't affect the 97% of this population, you will be the ones who decide the outcome. So please take that responsibility seriously.
Thank you, Shelley. Lisa?
Yeah, I guess it is a huge year, and it's something that I think it was Kate Blanchett who said on 7:30 the other night that this is an incredible opportunity for us, and I really hope that AAP is doing its part in providing factual information so people can cut out the spin, cut out everyone else's opinion, and focus on the facts of the issue. And I would really encourage everyone on the call and to share with your friends just that there is a lot of information available. You keep hearing this line through the media, which is driving me mad, or not through the media, through politicians saying, oh, we don't have any detail. There's a lot of detail out there. You can find it. And yeah, it's up to everyone to make their choices, of course, but very passionate about the media acting responsibly over the next 4 or 5 months.
Thank you, Lisa. And on that note, we should note Lisa's posted in the chat that the AFR has apologised for running that advert today and said that they should never have run it. So that's a really positive turn of events. Last words from me. This is the most important NAIDOC week that we may ever have in our history, that we've had in our history to date. Please get active in the conversation about the referendum and make sure that your vote is an informed one. We are voting on the constitutional recognition of our First Nations people, the people who've lived here and looked after this land since time immemorial, and done such a wonderful job of it. It's been my absolute pleasure to host this panel. Topaz McAuliffe, Lisa Davies and Shelley Cable, thank you so much for joining today and for sharing your views. Thanks to The Iconic for sponsoring this series, and thank you to Mentor Walks for having us all. Have a lovely evening, ladies and gentlemen, and have a wonderful NAIDOC week.